Hi, welcome to my first video on imaginary numbers. And the first video is the definition of an imaginary number. Recall, real numbers are made up of the rational numbers and the irrational numbers. The rational numbers are defined as a over b, where a and b belong to the integers and b is not equal to 0. We cannot have a 0 in the denominator of a fraction, and that would be like a half, negative 3 over 5, 8 over 9, or it could be defined as repeating or terminating decimal, terminating as in decimal 2, repeating as in 1.4. The 4 is repeating. And irrational numbers are non-repeating, non-terminating decimals, as in pi or root 2 or root 7 or decimal 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, 1, 8, 9, ... There's no digits repeats. So, an imaginary number is the square root of a negative number. And let me illustrate that. And we'll turn on the calculator here. Let's do the square root of a negative 4 on the calculator. And we have, notice the square root of a negative 4 is domain is zeros. We cannot do the square root of a negative number, as in square root of negative 1, square root of negative 3, square root of negative 9, square root of negative 18, square root of negative 100, etc. So we develop a new set of numbers. All imaginary numbers are defined by the square root of negative 1, which is 1i or I. So imaginary numbers are the square root of a negative number. Let's do some examples. Simplify as bi, where b belongs to the reals. So the square root of a negative 4 is the square root of 4 times negative 1, which is the square root of 4 times the square root of a negative 1. So the square root of 4 is 2, square root of negative 1 is an I. And I'm going to work all of these like this. So the square root of negative 16 is the square root of 16 times negative 1, which is the square root of 16 times the square root of negative 1. Square root of 16 is 4, square root of negative 1 is an I. So the square root of a negative number will have an I. Square root of a negative 49 is the square root of 49 times negative 1. That's the square root of 49 times the square root of a negative 1. Square root of 49 is 7. Square root of a negative 1 is an I. And we have the square root of a negative 3, the square root of 3 times negative 1, which is the square root of 3 times I. And when we have a radical, normally most textbooks and teachers will put the I in front of the radical, not behind it. The square root of a negative 10 is the square root of 10 times negative 1, which is the square root of 10 times the square root of negative 1. So that's the square root of 10 times I, and that's written as I root 10. F, the square root of a negative 12, is the square root of 12 times negative 1. And that's the square root of 12 times I. But the square root of 12 is 4 times 3. So the square root of 12 is 2 root 3 times I. And we write 2I root 3. Again, the I goes in front of the root. Square root of a negative 50 is the square root of 50 times negative 1. So that's the square root of 50 times the square root of a negative 1. And that gives you square root of 50. Well, let's work both of them out. 25 times 2. So the square root of 50 is 5 root 2 times square root of negative 1 is an I. So that gives 5I root 2. And we have the square root of a negative 27. Again, every time you do the square root of a negative number, you're going to get an I. And we should always simplify the square root of a negative number first before we do anything else with that imaginary number. That's the square root of 27 times negative 1. That's the square root of 27 times the square root of negative 1. The square root of 27 is 9 times 3. So square root of 27, square root of 9 is 3 root 3 times I. And that's 3I root 3. Just takes a while to get used to writing them down. So let's continue. And we have a practice page. So pause your video and work each of these out. Press play when you get them done to see how well you're doing. Simplify each as bi, where b is a real number. So the square root of a negative 1 is just I. That's by definition. The square root of a negative 1 is I, 1I. And the square root of negative 9 is the square root of 9 times negative 1. That's the square root of 9 times the square root of negative 1. So that's a square root of 9 is 3. Square root of negative 1 is an I. Square root of negative 25 is the square root of 25 times negative 1. Square root of 25 times the square root of negative 1. Square root of 25 is 5. Square root of negative 1 is an I. So notice again, every time you have a negative number underneath a square root, you're going to have an I. That's the square root of 36 times negative 1. Square root of 36 times the square root of negative 1. Square root of 36 is 6. Square root of negative 1 is an I, 6I. And the square root of negative square root of negative 5 is the square root of 5 times negative 1. That's the square root of 5 times the square root of a negative 1. Square root of 5, you can't do it, so it's square root of 5 times I. And that's written as I root 5. I always put the I in front of my root. If it can't simplify it to like a 5, if it leaves, the radical stays there, I always put the I in front. Square root of negative 17 is the square root of 17 times negative 1. Square root of 17 times the square root of negative 1, sorry. So that's the square root of 17 times I, and that gives you I root 17. Square root of negative 18 is the square root of 18 times negative 1. That's the square root of 18 times the square root of a negative 1. Square root of 18 is 9 times 2, so the square root of 18 is 3 root 2. Square root of 9 is 3 root 2. Square root of negative 1 is an I, so that gives me 3I root 2. Square root of negative 32 is the square root of 32 times negative 1. That's the square root of 32 times the square root of negative 1. And the square root of 32 is a 16 times 2, perfect square. So 16 is the largest perfect square factor of 32, so it's a 4 root 2 times I. So that's 4I root 2. Square root of negative 75 is the square root of 75 times negative 1. That's the square root of 75 times the square root of negative 1. Square root of 75, I see a 5, so I see 25 times 3. So that's a 5 root 3. Square root of 25 is 5. Can't do the square root of 3. Square root of negative 1 is an I, so that becomes 5I root 3. Square root of a negative 200 is the square root of 200 times negative 1. That's the square root of 200 times the square root of negative I. 200 is made up of 100 times 2. Square root of 100 is 10, so it's 10 root 2. 10 root 2 times I, so it's 10I root 2. Now, I'm showing you how to work these out, but we don't really have to write it down like this all the time. I'm going to take a faster way. Now that I've explained why this becomes an I because of square root of -1, let's do it a faster way. Here's the faster way. Watch. Notice I have a negative number. So that means I'm automatically going to have an I. So what's the square root of 64? 8. What's the square root of -81? Square root of 81 is 9, and it got to be an I because it's negative. Square root of -11, can't do the square root of 11, so it's the root of 11, and it has to have an I, but the I goes in front of the root. The square root of a -20 is, the square root of 20 is 4 times 5. So it's a 2, and there's an I, so the I goes in front of the root. So square root of 20 is 4 times 5, so that's a 2 root 5, but the I goes in front. Square root of -45, 45 is 9 times 5, and I have to have an I, so that's a 3 root 5. So it's a 3I root 5, y and I, because you get the square root of a negative number. And practice the fast way. Pause your video and work these out. Here I go, the square root of a -100. Square root of 100 is 10. It's an I because of a negative number. Square root of a -121. Square root of 121 is 11. And because it's negative, I have an I. Square root of -13 is, can't do the root of 13. Because it's a negative, I have to have an I, but the I goes in front of the root. The square root of -28 is going to have an I, but square root of 28 is the square root of 4 times 7. So that's a 2 root 7. But it's got to have an I, so it's a 2I root 7. Again, check with your teacher. Probably your teacher don't mind if you write it like that, like root 13I. You probably don't mind if you go 2 root 7I. But check with your teacher if the I goes in front of the root or behind it. It's your teacher who's marking it, but most books will put the I in front of the root. So that's explaining what an imaginary number is, the square root of a negative number. If you like my video, click on the like button, subscribe button, and notification bell because more videos are coming your way. Visit my math website, www.mathfullyexplained.com, to find more information about me, my videos, and the content, and that's the content that's on my YouTube channel called Math Fully Explained. Thank you for viewing my video. Bye-bye.